and welcome to the Empty Chair, Keeping the Mind in Mind. My name is Previn Karian. Now, if you've just landed on this video, please make sure you check out the introductory video to this channel's objectives, as well as the video on misogyny and Jung's shadow. This video will not make sense if you haven't watched the video on misogyny and Jung's shadow. I'll post the links in the description below. I hope you're aware that I'm trying to push out a lot of educational material here quite quickly, so please work through the relevant videos responsibly so that you can get the best out of this content. There are also a series of videos in the psychosocial playlist to explain the clinical methodology behind the models I am using. So please refer to those videos if you want a better explanation or understanding of the content here. I can't fit everything into one video, so it's a case of creating separate educational videos in a series of steps. And you'll find those educational videos in the psychosocial playlist section of this channel. Now, this video is a follow-up to the previous one where I looked at 3 responses to the masculinity crisis in the West that exclude any psychological analysis of the shadow. I've outlined the shadow psychology, which is a term used by Carl Jung for the dark and repressed or split off psychology that sits within heterosexual men. It's the shadow psychology that we find in misogyny, as well as in racism and fascism. Now, Freud used the term the unconscious to describe the same mental area or mental space as Carl Jung. And that mental space is what separates psychoanalysis from other psychological methods. So if misogyny is a psychological problem, the model I am using to analyze it is the model of the unconscious shadow from Freud and Jung. So to work through this video, you'll need to be familiar with the concept of the unconscious or the shadow as a mental space of repressed mental contents in the heterosexual male mind. And this is a psychoanalytic model of mind. It should move us away from using the word misogyny as a shaming or attacking label and try to get inside the engine and understand something psychological about its process and how it operates in heterosexual men. What I will be focusing on in this video is the inferiority complex that sits in the unconscious shadow of heterosexual men and that we carry around with us all the time in a way that women cannot understand. And this is what acts out in misogyny that men cannot see because it remains out of sight and unconscious to our ego functioning. So the unconscious and the shadow of anyone's mind contains numerous contents that are troubling, distressing, hateful, and violent. And these mental contents can break down our normal ego functioning. This means that when our social or relationship functioning breaks down, it is usually because there are contents in the unconscious or shadow psychology that have built up to an explosive degree and have to discharge their energy. They can't be repressed or pushed down anymore. And so they create symptoms and behaviors that either destroy ourselves, and that's in anxiety, self-harm, suicide, crippling low self-esteem and self-worth, or those repressed mental contents of our unconscious shadow act out on and destroy other people. And that's when we get cruelty, rage, violence, and destruction. Now, if we apply this to misogyny, that means we have two forms of psychological misogyny here. One is an internal process where men can destroy themselves because of a disconnect with women. And the other is an external process where we act out our aggressive and demeaning behavior towards women in sadistic acts. So one is internal, where we can't live without them, and one is external, where we actively act out sadistic actions towards women. So there is an internal and an external form of misogyny as a disconnect, anger, and hate of women in heterosexual men that we are not aware of, because all this sits in our shadow psychology, out of sight of our ego functioning. So our everyday ego functioning is in conflict with our unconscious mind. The unconscious, or shadow, contains our split off or repressed feelings, thoughts, desires, and memories. And our heterosexual male egos don't have the psychological capacity to look at or think about our internal or external misogyny as a fundamental biological disconnect with women. So what do? We push them down so that our ego can function in social life, and we walk around interacting with women while we are pushing the contents of our unconscious about women back down into the shadow psychology of our minds. Now, what are we trying to understand here? It's what is inside our shadow unconscious. And this is where Jung and Freud can help us. We want to find a model for what those contents are, the contents of the unconscious shadow psychology. And we want to understand how they disrupt our mental health or erupt into acts of violence and hate crimes against women. And we want to understand the destruction that we turn inwardly as men because of our disconnect with women. So that is the general psychoanalytic model in this channel. And we want to look at the disruption of the male ego functioning in misogyny because of our unconscious shadow contents. Now, to do that modelling work, I will be narrowing down to 3 specific areas that I consider to be mental health issues in heterosexual masculinity. These are the inferiority complex that we get from Carl Jung, and the sadistic drive and the masochistic drive that we get from Freud. The inferiority complex is a general problem for masculinity in our unconscious. And there will be more detailed videos on these in the psychosocial playlist. But here, I just want to look at some practical aspects of these 3 factors. So it's the inferiority complex, the sadistic drive, and the masochistic drive. 1 complex and 2 biopsychological drives sitting in the unconscious shadow psychology of heterosexual men. The inferiority complex and the 2 drives don't describe everything in the unconscious of men, but they are useful starting points to get something about misogyny that is being missed. Now, when Jung talks about the inferiority complex, he does not make it gender specific to men. And that is something that I'm doing here. I'm taking his model of mind and running its logic through masculinity to see if it can tell us something about the destructive psychology of men in misogyny. And strangely, inferiority is only a small part of his overall psychology. But working with it can give us some insights into what's happening in misogyny. So the inferiority complex in heterosexual men can be seen as a profound psychological wounding that comes from our biology and runs through the whole of our lives. And there will, of course, be more videos explaining that biological base that creates a psychological wounding in heterosexual men. So it's not just a loss of social, financial, or sexual power. Because men with social, financial, and sexual power still suffer terribly from their inferiority complex. And it's not solved by what they possess. And that's kind of strange. Men can have it all and still never have enough. So we need to key into the psychological dimension of our inferiority and to think about what inferiority means for heterosexual men psychologically. Now, a well-known Lacanian psychoanalyst called Darian Leader came out with a book on depression in 2008, and it was called The New Black. It's a clinical book about depression, which I actually reviewed for a counselling magazine at that time. Darian wanted to do research on depression, and he talks about going into a bookshop in London, looking around for books on depression, and suddenly realised that all the books he was looking at in the literature, fiction, psychology sections were all in some way about depression. Now, Darian is mostly concerned with depression as a process of mourning our losses and how we block ourselves from processing our loss. And because he is more clinical, what he doesn't really want to get into is the universality of depression. So it was not just everywhere in the bookshop. Depression is everywhere in the world of men. In other words, human existence contains something depressing about it, in case you hadn't noticed. It contains losses, failures, rejection, powerlessness. And at its most extreme form, we have the depression that comes from thinking about our own death and mortality, or the death of others. Now, what Darian doesn't get into is the connection between depression and the psychological dimension of inferiority that we feel as humans, and particularly as heterosexual males. And we feel that as men because we are driven to achieve the opposite of inferiority and depression. We are driven to achieve superiority. Darian's not interested in that connection because he is not a Jungian. So our masculine egos have to create a psychological defense to block us from thinking about depression and inferiority. Because otherwise, our egos as heterosexual men would not be able to function. So we push these negative thoughts into our unconscious system or our shadow psychology. But the trouble is, those contents eventually build up and come back to break our egos down. As I've explained in previous videos, this sets up a conflict between our ego functioning, our everyday functioning, and the repressed or split off part of our psyche that Jung called the shadow and Freud called the unconscious. Now, what has all this got to do with psychological inferiority in men? Put crudely, men have only one answer to the universal problem of our depression as finite human beings trying to make sense of mortal life. Our only solution as heterosexual men for depression and death is to achieve some kind of superiority. Superiority brings with it an ego satisfaction, a mental satisfaction that blocks out our feelings of inadequacy, our failures, our regrets. It blocks out our inferiority when we have to face the world and deal with our existence. The last thing we want to think about is feeling inferior. But in psychoanalysis, the blocking out of the ego is called a psychological defense mechanism. So men defend against the anxiety of our existence by flooding our conscious, everyday ego functioning systems with superiority. But this superiority does not give us any connection to life, and it often comes with a loss of life and relationships. We become obsessed with our constant need for superiority, or we become drowned with our failure to achieve it. Now, I've previously mentioned that men are gender stereotyped and biologically wired to achieve superiority. But this superiority doesn't seem to bring men any lasting peace or satisfaction. It's very temporary, and it keeps us restless, anxious, wanting more, and terrified that we will lose what we have. And when we fail to achieve superiority, we experience it like a crushing blow to the whole of our identity, our existence, to the core of who we are as men. So the depression that we feel is connected to the inferiority that we feel as men. And that inferiority makes us angry and enraged because we're powerless. But all that gets pushed down into our unconscious shadow. So in our mental space as men, superiority in our ego functioning is always connected to inferiority in our unconscious shadow, where we push things down. And that inferiority is not just about the things we possess that never make us feel secure. It's not just about our needs for sex, money, or power, which we can't get enough of. There's a deeper question of what our own death means to us as heterosexual men, which is a very serious issue in men struggling with depression, and why we fail to find happiness in material success. So whether we are a success or a failure, inferiority is a menacing mental factor that eats away at the mental spaces of men. It seems to be underneath all our achievements as men. If we follow the logic of Jung's model, it means that if we have a need to feel superior to women, there is something about women that makes men feel inferior. And that is a shattering thought for heterosexual men. This idea that there is something in women that actually makes us feel inferior, which is why we keep needing to feel superior to them. Our masculine egos can't function with that thought. So we push it down into our conscious. The thought that something in women makes heterosexual men feel inferior and activates our unconscious shadow contents. So where is this inferiority, and how does it actually operate? Because we cannot function if we keep thinking about our inferiority, men use our egos as a defense mechanism to push down our inferiority into the unconscious or shadow. And this keeps recreating the conflict between the ego and the unconscious for men, as men. So for us, the ego is constantly driving for superiority in relationships, society, at work, even in how we construct our friendships. Our unconscious or shadow starts to then swarm and collect up all our inferiorities and inadequacies. And what we have to do as men is actively push those out of the sight of our ego functioning. Now let's try and run this psychological model through Carl Jung's shadow work and see if it can tell us anything useful about our misogyny. Carl Jung worked at the same time as his contemporary Alfred Adler on modelling the psychology of what they called the inferiority complex in the 1920s. Adler looked at the inferiority complex in terms of social inferiority and a lack of social power, while Jung held a focus on individual psychology and how inferiority operated in there. So in technical language, Adler looked at interpersonal inferiority, while Jung looked at intrapsychic inferiority. And that's the inferiority that accumulates in the individual mind. If you're interested in Adler, there is a great collection of papers called Superiority and Social Interest, which you can look at for further research. But for us here, this means that men can feel inferiority because of social reasons, but men as individuals carry an intrapsychic personal inferiority, which is about how they feel to be alive, how they feel about existing as men. And that is the inferiority I want to isolate and focus on. Now, I could do at least 3 videos on how Jung developed this model, and I might do a bit later, but let's stick to the easiest formulation of his inferiority complex. You can find this inferiority model in volume 6 of his collected works, also known by the title of Psychological Types. It's quite a heavy volume. It's a wrist-spraining 550 pages long. But if you look up the word inferiority in the index, it will key you into the main passages that discuss it. Because apart from one chapter, which is chapter 6, a very technical chapter, he scatters what he says about inferiority throughout the book. So let's try and piece it together by working through some of his quotes. So firstly, he says, the unconscious is a compensating attitude. If we apply this just to men in the area of misogyny, what Jung is saying here is that if men are driven to ego superiority to survive and function socially, we then create an unconscious opposite inferiority, which we push out of our sight and into an unconscious mental space. So the way we search for superiority is actually driven by the way we feel inferior. Because our superiority has to compensate, it has to make up for that inferior feeling that we're pushing in our unconscious. So this means that our inferiority is always there, and it carries emotional trigger points around how we want to be superior as men, how we react when that superiority is threatened. And this goes some way to explaining our agitation and our unease with women after our initial attractions to them. We need to feel superior to women because there is something about women that activates our unconscious inferiority, according to Jung's model. So women activate our inferiority. Now, in Jung's model, our inferiority is the mental pressure point that drives us to be superior. We can achieve superiority through physical strength, through educational privilege, or financial, economic, corporate, or institutional superiority. If we need to be superior to women, it's because unconsciously in our shadow mental space, we feel inferior to them and we don't know why. We don't know why because it's buried in our unconscious shadow. But we keep that space invisible and buried, not just to other people, but also to ourselves. And this is the unconscious mental space of heterosexual men in our psychological relation to women, which is never really discussed. And that's what I meant when in my previous misogyny interview for ITT Mind, I said that men are terrified of women. It's in our unconscious mental space that we carry a terror and an inferiority that women activate in our psychology. And when we approach women with our superiority, women will activate our inferiority just by being there. But we know that a growing majority of men are failing economically, socially, and in relationships. And if men have to continually face social or personal failures, and we can't achieve any superiority at all in our lives, what do we do? When men fail socially and financially, we search for our mental compensation in the fantasies of our unconscious mind. We are driven to search for, act out of, and find nothing else except fantasies. And this explains the epidemic of porn and gaming addiction in the West, of men going into their 40s and 50s. It's a compensation in our fantasies for our defeated realities, for our externally visible inferiority in the failures, socially and financially, that we can't hide from ourselves. And when our failures and inferiorities are external and in our face, we turn to find sexual or violent superiority in addictive fantasies on a screen. Fantasies are a space where men can feel superior because we are not, and we don't know what to do about it. So according to Jung's psychological formula of compensation, if men want to know what's in our unconscious, look at where our superiority is, especially in our fantasies and what we dream our life to be. The way we need to feel superior gives us the clue as to where our opposite inferiority is. And when we act out our violence and aggression on women or children or even each other as a way of expressing superiority through external aggression, this formula from Jung is telling us that such behavior is the power and force of a built-up inferiority in our unconscious. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of people in boxing and MMA and violent sports have had very abusive childhoods, physically abusive childhoods, sometimes at the hands of their own fathers. And I'm thinking here particularly of Roy Jones Jr., who was an amazing boxer, but had a very punishing, physically abusive father. So we are trying to compensate for something psychologically. Jung's formula of compensation here tells us that it's our psychological inferiority as men that drives us to feel superior to women. And if we feel emasculated, it's because we don't have that superiority internally. The question then this raises is, why would men feel so psychologically inferior to women when women are just human beings like us? Let's hold that question for now. Let's move on to the next quote. An identity expresses itself in a compulsive dependency when inferiority is involved. So here Jung is saying that although we think our identity, which is who we are, is in our ego-conscious world of what we have achieved, like jobs, house, partners, children, property, possessions, and money, there is another level at which our inferiority develops a secret compulsion and dependency on people or things we don't want to admit to. So the key words here are compulsive dependency and identity. We have an ego identity and an unconscious identity, and we bury the unconscious identity out of sight of the ego. But our unconscious is a big part of who we are. Even in the richest and most successful men, Jung's idea of compulsive dependency in the unconscious shadow points to men's addictions to sex, women, power, violence, while trying to appear as if we are really decent and civilized men who are in control of our lives. In the conflict with the ego identity in heterosexual men, we have an unconscious identity of who we really are that is built on our unconscious shadow contents. And that's not a pleasant thought. So when our ego thinks of our identity, of who we are, it has to exclude and cut out our unconscious contents, those split off feelings, memories, desires and thoughts that form into addictions and compulsive dependencies. But Jung and psychoanalysis in general bring the unconscious back into our identity, into who we truly are. But there is a deeper level of inferiority when we look at women because of the power they hold over our minds and the obsessiveness, the irrational and mentally deranged states of dependency that men fall into with women. And we can particularly see this when we think we're in love with them or when we lose them. What happens to our identities here? What blocks our egos from seeing this part of our identity, the compulsive dependency on women for who we are? Who we are, the sense of our identity, has to include the contents of our unconscious shadow. But if those contents grow to a compulsive level where our egos can no longer control them, they break out and disrupt our ego superiority and cause a lot of harm to ourselves and, of course, towards other women. So the quote from Jung here asks us to think about why heterosexual men become obsessed with women compulsively, why we need them in our psychological states, and why our lives can be destroyed when we're with them or without them. Why we feel able and free to lash out to them in anger or criminal abuse, rape, and murder. Why is this compulsion to oppress women there at all in men? And not just as individuals, but also as part of cultures and traditions and political institutions in the world today. Compulsive dependency on women is a mental state that is stuck in the unconscious shadow of heterosexual men. But psychologically, it goes very deep. It goes down to our sense of identity as men. And we'll be developing why that happens to us in our relation to women. So, although our egos are not aware of it, our unconscious and its contents also form part of our identity through our compulsions. And our relation to women is primarily built on unconscious compulsive needs. Compulsion means we are not in control. Our egos are not in control. So this is who we really are when the light stops shining on our ego superiority with women. And when we fall into the darkness of our violence, our depression, and the addictions of our fantasies in our unconscious shadow contents about women. And that is the work of shadow psychology and psychoanalysis. It looks at inferiority in the unconscious of men and how it operates through compulsive dependency on women for our identity as heterosexual men and for our sense of being alive. Now let's move on to the next quote. Compulsive feelings of inferiority. Now, focusing more generally on the superiority-inferiority relationship, Jung here is pointing out that although men can start with a feeling of superiority over women or in our social roles or sexual conquests, we become aware of our internal emptiness and meaninglessness, not just about women, but about life in general. We constantly carry a feeling of inferiority about both life and women, even though we spend all our time trying to be superior in both areas. So there is a general structure of inferiority about life and women that sits in the masculine unconscious shadow. And this general inferiority in our internal world as men gets triggered into violent rage and violent acts because we can't psychologically orientate ourselves in a peaceful existence towards life or women or even other men. So a constant rage at our general feeling of inferiority can erupt unpredictably. But it can also be a form of planned cruelty, which we enjoy in torture, murder, rape, and other forms of criminal abuse against women. So Jung is pointing out that rage and violence, because of our unconscious inferiority, is compulsively present in our masculinity all of the time, buried in our shadow psychology. So it's the size of our inferiority as individual men and the size of our inferiority collectively as men that is the massive problem that we have to start with today. It either breaks us down into mental health issues or it becomes psychopathic violence against others. And this is acted out not just against women, but in the way we construct societies and institutions. The egos of heterosexual men are continually finding ways to defend and block off our unconscious feeling of inferiority. And because we don't explore this psychologically, we act it out in society, in institutions, and against women. So, given the historical scale of the psychological problem of inferiority in masculinity, it is clear that we cannot turn to women to solve that weight, that burden, and that magnitude of inferiority in our psychology. They just don't have the answer. And because it is compulsively present, inferiority is an enormous psychological burden that heterosexual men are carrying all the time. And our egos are constantly defending against and blocking it off. Now, if you read Jung's book, Psychological Types, he doesn't really discuss inferiority in terms of gender issues. He was more interested in how inferiority differed between introvert personalities and extrovert personalities. So when he talks about inferiority, he's really talking about it as something he's stumbled across, and he applies it in a different arena in terms of introverts and extroverts. So this is something he didn't really get round to doing, to run his model through the problem of masculinity. But one of the indicators that he does say that occurs in both introverts and extroverts is that you can identify inferiority when people start to act with irritability, outbursts, and quick impulsive reactivity. And that level of repressed anger is something that he very helpfully connects with our inferiority, that there's something actually we're feeling inferior about, and we want our superiority, our ego superiority, to be protected. So just to clarify, Jung's model is not gender specific, and I am running it not even as a gender study, but just very specifically to try and help men. So we now come to the last of the quotes. He talks about, with the inferior function, the energy left to it passes into the unconscious and activates it in an unnatural way, giving rise to fantasies. Now, we've already talked about fantasies, and here Jung is focusing on fantasies and their relation to inferiority in a very specific way. He observes that in our unconscious inferiorities, which we don't want to look at, our inferiorities create a world of fantasies in our heads that compensate for our defeated realities. So these fantasies are not just addictions to porn or gaming where men escape to feel superior or get some kind of power in their lives. It's also in fantasies of power over other people, but not just any people. It is power over weak people. We pick on weak people. And this explains the unconscious and ego-conscious roles that heterosexual men play out with women. Now, anyone physically, economically, or legally weaker than heterosexual men become our prey that we exploit to give us a sense of power, especially in our relationship to women. So when we look at the conquest and oppression that men conduct over weaker humans in society in general, and with women in particular, this model tells us that we are operating from a psychological inferiority because actually we don't know what it means to be a human being with other human beings. And we don't know how to do life with fairness. So this leads to the incredible position that equality is not a natural concept for the heterosexual male ego. It needs superiority, and that means it needs weak people, weaker than it, in order to feel superior. So our fantasies and dreams of superiority and greatness, compensating for and block off our internal feelings of chaos and inferiority, all affect our identity and our existence as men. The heterosexual male ego does not know how to do life, but it does naturally know how to destroy life. And likewise, we don't know how to have relationships with women. Ask them. But we do know how to destroy them. Or we do know how to destroy ourselves when we are without them. Our fantasies don't succeed in saving us from our realities, but we still turn to our fantasy world as a defense, And these can be the fantasy of a father, a husband, a worker that provides for his home, when in reality, we find ourselves isolated from the very people that we think we love and who we think love us. And we then have to face our defeated realities in 56% divorce rates. So all the power that our fantasies can achieve are never enough, and they break down. But it also means that there are never enough weak people to exploit, to go to war with, or to abuse in professional or personal relationships. We go from one relationship to another and another and another. And the more that women have fought back for their legal and economic rights, the more they have protested about the behaviour of men, the more aggression they have triggered in men, because they unconsciously trigger our inferiorities. So we play along with equality, but we act out our power over women in our fantasies unconsciously. So using Jung's formulation here, we can see that men are mostly living lives of chasing fantasies and dreams, where they find objects that they think will satisfy them, and they don't, because those people, and they're not objects, are part of our fantasies, and we can't handle the reality of different people to us. And what's more, we can't handle our own mortality, our own lack of power and significance in the universe, our finiteness, the limitations of our reality. And we'll talk later about how fantasies can either create or destroy our world in general and relationships with women in particular. And the next quote, the contents of the unconscious are so intimately bound up with dangerous and menacing aspects of the unconscious that its appearance may actually call forth evil and destructive tendencies. Now, in the 1920s, Jung was very concerned about the unconscious shadow containing our destructive tendencies. But when our unconscious fantasies get joined up with the fantasies of other men, or get connected collectively in a group or a nation, Jung saw the huge scale of the dangerous and menacing aspect of the unconscious. And this becomes very dramatic when violence, anger, destruction and death actually erupt but become politically and socially legitimized and normalized as a cultural, religious or national practice. So Jung was very sensitive to the collective capacity of the unconscious to destroy, because he also had some very traumatic dreams about Europe being covered in fields of blood before World War I. So for Jung, the unconscious was not just an individual, but also a collective danger. And a lot of his thought went on in that direction of the collective unconscious and its contents after 1925. Now, this makes the collective psyche of men in relation to women really difficult when we think of men's destructive capacities and destructive urges in sexual or physical violence collectively. The rolling back of abortion rights in America, or the violent suppression of women's protests in Iran after the murder of Mahsa Amini by the morality police, they're just two of thousands of examples where men's superiority act out destructive psychological content towards women from our unconscious shadow as a collective practice, where men agree that our behaviour against women's rights are just normal. So here we have the problem with my very first interview on misogyny. Heterosexual men have no capacity to call out each other on our violence and destruction. We can't talk to each other about our humiliation and our degrading of women. whether it happens sexually, emotionally, financially, or verbally. We can't mentally process facts and data about misogyny. Our thinking gets blocked and goes silent when we're asked to explain why we do things. And we then get triggered with inferiority and rage. Our brains just can't take in our own collective violence as empirical data. And if any man does try to understand what is happening, well, he's just a feminist, self-hating, woke, Marxist, socialist idiot. And that's the level, that's the maximum capacity that men have to talk about, reflect on, and analyse our destructive drives. So in our unconscious need for being strong and superior, we have no place to analyse the scale of our inferiority and its destruction against women as a collective fact about men. So when Jung invites us to think about the inferiority in our unconscious, he's also interested in its destructive capacity collectively, which is what we are trying to isolate and analyse in this channel. Our collective unconscious as men together across the planet and across historical times contains our destructive and brutalizing drives towards women. And we can't name it, we can't admit it, we can't identify it psychologically, and we can't analyze it. But if we can start to see the inferiority in our unconscious shadow collectively, which is why I referred to the male species, whilst I understand species is a reference to both women and men. But if we try and isolate the male as a species in its capacity for destruction, as historical men throughout time, it will key us into our destructive and angry relations with women. And finally, Jung talks about the danger of devastation, of inundation and destruction, a great catastrophe similar to the devastation of a country by floods. So here Jung takes the idea of collective destruction and collective unconscious one step further. He identifies the national catastrophe of irrational destruction that whole nations can carry out against each other or towards their own citizens and subjects. And when we look at the geopolitical threats and destruction of military wars and the sole control of men, when we look at the gradual depletion and attack of citizens within their states, we can see in Jung a psychological formulation for why this occurs. He describes it as a flooding, and that is an important word. Whenever men are flooded with rage and violence, even while conducting it with cold and calculated methods, we are under the grip of unconscious shadow contents where our inferiorities are erupting collectively. If you can picture the violence of men against women over thousands and thousands of years in cultural practices and religions, in political and social organizations, you can see that flood of our inferior need to be superior against physically weaker humans than us, which is what women embody. Women trigger our collective unconscious as men. Collective misogyny still occurs across nations in cultural, religious and political practices across whole nations and countries in the West and the East. So all our progress in women's rights and equal status in the West has not touched the inferiority in our masculine unconscious as a collective in relation to women. And that's why it hasn't touched the aggression that gets activated towards women when we try to think about them as equals. Now, after all this quite lengthy lecture, you might probably be wondering, why should we bother with the unconscious at all? If it's so dangerous, so negative, so explosive, and so historically universal in men, shouldn't it just be locked up and pushed down even deeper into our shadow so that we keep it out of sight? But here's the psychological problem. The more we do that, the more we split off from our unconscious, the more power it accumulates to drive us into irrational behaviours of rage and destruction. So we either become a victim to our unconscious and all of its raging contents, unable to control our fate, or we gain a reflective relationship with our unconscious so that we can see it, and then we have some choices about whether to act on it or not. But this is more than just controlling the unconscious, which, by the way, we never absolutely fully do. We can only have stronger degrees of choice over it. And this is what Jung says in a seminar on children's dreams between 1936 and 1940. He says, the descent into the unconscious can be visualized as being devoured by the whale dragon, as going down into a dark cave or into the castle of the evil magician. We go there to get something. As a rule, it is a valuable treasure or a marvelous precious stone. So self-confrontation with our unconscious is not just about getting in control of our violence and rage as men towards women who are weaker than us. It's not just about refusing to be victims of our fate, our biology, or our stereotyping, our gender stereotyping. And it's not just about being free from our compulsive psychological dependencies on women, groups, or nation states. In our psychological self-confrontation, we go there to get something. As a rule, it is a valuable treasure or a marvelous, precious stone. So what is that treasure? What is that stone? There is a form of masculinity that men have not yet discovered because we have not made the individual or the collective journey to face our shadow contents in our unconscious minds. But if we have the strength to look at our wounding as men, our inferiority in the unconscious shadow, we can find a form of pure masculinity. What that will look like cannot be put into a formula. It's not a quick fix answer that you can sell on Amazon or YouTube or in a book. It's a highly individualized sense of who you are, your identity, and who you are meant to be, regardless of everything that has tried to destroy your life from your unconscious mental contents. It's a solid treasure, a psychological treasure, as enduring as stone. In Jung's language, it is the pure masculine archetype, free from women, aggression, and groups, and free to express itself in your individual life as a man, if you work with it. So let's summarize the pattern of unconscious inferiority in Jung and how it implies specifically for heterosexual men in misogyny. The unconscious mental space where our mental health issues and our rage and aggression live is a response to the conflict between the ego and the unconscious. The masculine ego is gender stereotyped and biologically wired into achieving success, measured solely through superiority. Ego superiority will create its opposite, an unconscious inferiority which has to stay unconscious and out of sight of the ego. If men need to feel superior to women, this formula tells us that psychologically in our unconscious shadow, women trigger an inferiority in us. But this inferiority is kept out of sight of our ego functioning.
Yeah.
While the masculine ego rejects its own unconscious contents, those contents start to build up into an aggregate inferiority, which then explodes into rage against other people or rage against oneself. In the case of misogyny, it is rage against women that builds up in our unconscious as heterosexual men. Now, rage against oneself, which is self-hate, self-rejection, self-harm, depression, suicide, is where men's mental health issues are recognized, and we can act out those behaviors when women leave us or when we feel rejected or fail in our relationships with women. And that's recognized as mental health. Rage and violence against weaker others, such as women, are not recognized as mental health issues. Rage and violence between groups in racism or countries in military wars are also not recognized as mental health issues. But if we apply Jung's model of mind, all these behaviors come from the same source, the unconscious or the shadow psychology of heterosexual men, where a profound inferiority has no idea how to do life and existence. And this makes the unconscious and the world of shadow psychology the most powerful determinant in human behavior, in human social organization, and in individual, group, and national eruptions of violence conducted by men. And men's egos don't see it because the unconscious remains out of sight of our ego, which is fixated on superiority. Both Jung and Freud tried to model the unconscious contents of the shadow psychology in a model of the human mind. Jung worked with a model of inferiority, which then leads to compensating fantasy formation in the unconscious. And these fantasies erupt in menacing and dangerous violence and destruction. The eruption of the unconscious can take the forms of misogyny, as well as racism and fascism. And the eruption of unconscious contents occurs not just in individuals, but also in groups and whole countries with their laws and cultural practices collectively. All these are eruptions of violence and destruction. And they also complete our identity in heterosexual masculinity as to who we really are. Our ego superiority tries to ignore identifying our unconscious contents because masculine egos want to appear in our superiority alone. So we need a model of mind to explain our destructiveness and our unconscious inferiority, especially in misogyny. We need a psychological framework to give us something to work with, some kind of starting point to make sense of the lunacy of masculine existence that finds peace with the world, peace with ourselves, peace with women, and even peace with each other so hard to achieve. We need to take another look at our masculine identity that includes our unconscious contents. But if we work through that psychological act of self-confrontation and the contents of our unconscious, presented here in Misogyny as the inferiority complex from Jung and 2 sadistic drives from Freud, we will find something very psychologically unique to our life as a man. That life, the life of masculinity, does not depend on women destroying weaker others or blindly following groups or what the state tells you to do. It is the beginning of our psychological life as heterosexual men, where perhaps for the first time our minds are not told to be still, controlled, domesticated, or driven to success, but the first time that our minds are allowed to breathe. Right now, as men, our minds can't breathe. We are being suffocated by our unconscious mental health contents, and we don't even know how to talk about it. This video and this channel is a start. I hope you found this video useful and not too academic and boring. And the next video will be on the 2 drives in Freud's model, based on the sadistic drive and the masochistic drive in the unconscious, and how they operate in our masculine shadow psychology in relation to women and misogyny. Please like, share and subscribe. This is not an algorithm-friendly channel, so please donate to keep this project independent and help me to produce more content. The videos in this channel will also be uploaded onto Rumble. Thanks for listening and see you soon.